Okay, guys, settle down. We have a very special treat for you today. We've got a couple of special guests, Teresa Richardson and Steve Adams from the Council for Wildlife Conservation and Education. The Council's mission is to provide all Americans, but particularly school audiences like us, with information on wildlife conservation in America. The Council believes that the best way to ensure support for wildlife conservation programs in the future is to make us all aware of the history of wildlife conservation in America, both the successes and the failures, and most importantly, to tell us what we need to do to make sure that there will be healthy wildlife populations in the future. So, welcome, please, Steve and Teresa.
Thank you, Mr. Baker.
Yes, thank you. Now, when Mr. Baker mentioned failures, I noticed a lot of uneasy looks. Don't worry, you're not going to be tested on any of this.
Mr. Baker referred to failures in the area of wildlife conservation. Well, I guess he's done his homework, and he knows we haven't always been as responsible as we should in America. We treat our wildlife. In fact, there was a time when we probably deserved a big fat F. But over the years, we've improved our grade, and many believe that the United States has the best wildlife conservation program in the world.
We've got about a 20-minute presentation for you today, including some video and some commentary from wildlife professionals. And we'll save plenty of time after if you have any questions after the presentation.
Speaking of questions, we'd like to start off by asking you guys a few. Don't worry, you don't have to write anything down. You're not going to be graded.
All right, for starters, does anyone know what the name of this species is? And do you think that there are more, about the same number, or fewer in America than there were 100 years ago?
Do we recognize this species? And do we think there are fewer today than 100 years ago? More? The same number?
Now, we all know who this guy is, right? But do you think that there are more, about the same number, or fewer than 100 years ago?
We all recognize this waterfowl species, but do we think there are fewer today than 100 years ago? More? The same number?
Here we have a very interesting species. Does anyone know what this animal is called? And do you think there are more, the same number, or fewer than there were 100 years ago?
Here's the last species we'd like you to identify, if you can. And do we think there are more, fewer, or the same than 100 years ago?
Okay, last question. What do you think is the biggest threat to wildlife today? Is it destruction of habitat, those areas that wildlife need for food and shelter? Is it hunting? Or is it the same natural factors that have impacted wildlife forever, disease and natural predators? Remember your answers. And if Teresa and I do our jobs today, then by the end of the presentation, you'll have all those answers.
Steve and I travel all over the country, and not surprisingly, the knowledge of the animals we've shown you varies from region to region. But this animal, everyone seems to know. Of course, it's a deer, but more specifically, it's a white-tailed deer. How many of you knew it? Most of you, good, but that was the easy part. How many of you think there are more today than 100 years ago? The same number? Fewer? Most of you said fewer. Very interesting. Well, I'm happy to tell you there are more. Many, many more.
You serious?
In fact, there are 40 times more white-tailed deer in America than there were 100 years ago.
All of the animals that we've shown you today exist in far greater numbers than they did 100 years ago. We call these animals our unendangered species, and we're here today to tell you their story.
There's no way of knowing how many deer, elk, and turkey there were before the first settlers arrived in North America. But experts agree the numbers were impressive. Tens of millions for some species. The forests, prairies, and wetlands of North America were open and unspoiled. But back then, just as today, we had a major impact on our environment. And as more and more settlers cleared land for homes and fields and began migrating westward, they slowly but surely pushed wildlife out of their habitat. As the colonies became small cities, and small cities grew into large metropolitan areas, forests and other wildlife habitat areas were cleared. New towns began springing up as colonists and settlers moved further and further west. Western expansion had two effects on wildlife, both bad. Habitat was depleted as trees were felled to provide shelter and fuel for man, and settlers exploited wildlife to feed themselves and to sell on the market.
The railroads opened up the West to settlers, and as the settlers moved out there was a tremendous impact on fish, wildlife, and on their habitats. One example is market hunting. Huge numbers of wildlife were slaughtered to provide food for city markets. In addition, there was the direct destruction of habitat for agriculture and other purposes. The combined effects of slaughtering wildlife and their loss of habitat resulted in the decline of many species, including some of those that are common today. In fact, in the 1880s, had the Endangered Species Act existed, it is very likely that the white-tailed deer would have been a listed species.
And this is where we begin the case history of our first unendangered species, the white-tailed deer. There are several species of deer in America, but the white-tail is by far the most abundant and makes a great first chapter in our story. In the earliest days of our nation, the white-tail was likely one of the most abundant of all North American wildlife species. But by the late 1800s, after some 200 years of habitat destruction and exploitation, the whitetail was in real danger of extinction. In fact, it had nearly or totally disappeared from some eastern states. The total nationwide population was estimated at less than 500,000, a tiny fraction of the number that had originally existed.
Things were looking grim for the whitetail, but fortunately, some Americans had recognized the dramatic decline and were committed to doing something about it. Sportsmen, hunters and anglers, and conservationists sounded the alarm and called for a halt to exploitation and for a beginning to conservation. Hunters and organized sportsmen's groups had already formed associations to protest the marketing of wild game such as deer and to call for an end to unregulated year-round commercial hunting. By 1900, these sportsman-sponsored associations were active in most states and were having success in limiting the sale of game. Activity to protect the whitetail really began to heat up in the early 1900s. Perhaps the most positive development for the whitetail and for all wildlife came with the 1901 presidential election of Theodore Roosevelt. An avid lover of the outdoors, President Roosevelt had already been deeply involved in conservation. As president, Roosevelt made it a priority to support legislation reducing the commercial exploitation of wildlife. One such piece of legislation was the Lacey Act of 1900, a law which banned interstate shipping of game taken illegally in the state of origin. By staunchly enforcing the Lacey Act, President Roosevelt effectively ended large-scale market hunting.
President Roosevelt also worked to establish national parks and refuges where wildlife could flourish. The first National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1903. As an example of his commitment, President Roosevelt had created 51 such refuges by the end of 1904. The national forest system more than tripled under President Roosevelt from 41 million acres in 1902 to 172 million acres in 1909. The efforts of our outdoorsman president helped bring the plight of wildlife to the forefront of national debate. This gave rise to the most important chapter in the history of the whitetail and all unendangered species, the birth of wildlife management.
The American system of wildlife management, which began in the early 1900s, is considered to be the best wildlife program in the world. Today, wildlife management in North America involves thousands of professional wildlife managers who are working on behalf of a diverse array of wildlife species. The challenges facing wildlife managers today are diverse and complex because different species in different areas of the country all face different problems. However, within these various challenges are universal issues that relate to all species. One such issue is determining what kind of habitat and how much of it a species needs in order to survive. And then we have to work to make sure that that habitat is available for that species. Predation, disease, and a species' food requirements are also key elements that a wildlife manager has to consider. White-tailed deer is a great example of how applying the principles of wildlife management has helped a species rally from dangerously low levels in the 1900s to a healthy, abundant population today.
State fish and wildlife agencies have played a critically important role in the success of wildlife management. Much more than just conservation officers, these agencies consist of biologists and wildlife specialists working to benefit many species of birds and animals. To make the comeback of the whitetail possible, these wildlife managers had to first determine the carrying capacity of the whitetail's habitat. Carrying capacity refers to the number of animals a habitat can sustain year-round. For example, an area that can support 500 deer in the summer, but only 100 in the winter, has a carrying capacity of 100 deer. Once this information was collected and analyzed, wildlife managers planned programs to reintroduce the deer into their former habitat through capture and transplant programs. By reclaiming territory from which the whitetail had long been absent, and then transplanting animals back into those areas, the whitetail deer population is as healthy today as it ever was.
But wildlife management wasn't working only on the whitetail. Wapiti was the name Native Americans gave to the impressive animal that we today call the Rocky Mountain elk. Surely the elk is among the most majestic and beautiful of our native species. Wildlife management experts estimate that 20 million elk roamed North America before the first European settlers arrived. And even though we call them Rocky Mountain elk and associate them with the West, the elk once ranged over most of the continent. There were once so many elk in the East that their trails were reportedly used as roads by traveling settlers. But just as with the white-tailed deer, the elk were pushed out of their habitat and saw their population greatly diminished. By the mid-1800s, the great elk herds of the East were no more. In the early 1900s, the total elk population nationwide was down to about 40,000, with the population centered around Yellowstone National Park.
Because elk are a migratory animal that utilize large landscapes, habitat conservation can be a real challenge. In the summer months, elk look for food at high altitudes right below the snow line. But in the cold months, elk come down to lower altitudes to look for food in the valleys, the very land that was taken up by settlement. Conservationists must ensure that the land will always support the needs of both wildlife and people. A good example of this is in Montana. In Montana, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, in cooperation with our state and federal agency partners, have purchased thousands of acres of threatened elk habitat to accommodate elk in the wintertime. These and other initiatives across the western states will help ensure the future of elk and elk country.
Thanks to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and other sportsman-sponsored groups, the elk population is now over 1 million. Elk can be found in all western states, and they've been recently reintroduced into some midwestern and eastern states. The future for the elk looks very bright indeed.
We all recognize a wild turkey as a symbol of our Thanksgiving holiday. But there was a time when just spotting a wild turkey was cause for celebration in and of itself. As hundreds of thousands of acres of eastern hardwood forests were cut, the nuts and acorns that the turkey counted on for food began to disappear, and then so did the turkey. By the 1930s, the turkey population was at a dangerously low level, and its very future was in doubt. As with the white-tailed deer, turkeys were totally gone from some states and seriously threatened in others. But across the nation, conservationists were planning and acting to bring the turkey back from the brink of extinction.
The wild turkey is a great example of one of the key principles of wildlife management, transplanting and restocking. As time passed, many of the small farms that replaced hardwood forests were no longer profitable, and they began to disappear. The trees that the wild turkey counted on for food started to return. The challenge for wildlife managers was to transplant the turkey back to this revitalized habitat.
To transport turkey back to their native habitat, a device called the cannon net was used. The birds were baited with grain and corn and trapped at the right moment. The trapping procedure got the turkeys a bit riled, but they weren't hurt. Gradually, area by area, state by state, the turkey made its comeback. We now have a population of 5.4 million wild turkey, and they can be found in 49 states. Why only 49? Alaska's just too cold and the winters are just too long for the wild turkey.
Another beautiful bird hurt by the loss of forest habitat was the wood duck. The wood duck is unique because it is one of the only species of duck that nests in trees. As forests were cleared, those trees disappeared, and so did wood duck nests. Another problem was that in the early 1900s, feathered hats were all the rage. The wood duck's glamorous feathers were much sought after by hat makers. Once again, we had the double-edged factors of loss of habitat and unregulated harvest. For a time, the wood duck's very survival was in doubt.
So it was over 60 years ago that concerned wildlife agencies and sportsmen's groups actually got together to develop a plan to help the wood duck rebound. A key element of this plan was to install thousands of wood duck nest boxes to replace the trees that had been lost when the forests were cleared. Coupled with the recovery of the forest and the reduction of what was previously year-round hunting pressure, the rebound of the wood duck was on its way. Today, the wood duck is the most abundant breeding waterfowl in the eastern United States.
The unendangered species that we've shown you so far were driven out of the east due to encroaching civilization and unregulated harvests. But the pronghorn was never found in the east. It's indigenous to the western plains, which meant that encroaching civilization and commercial exploitation had its impact on the pronghorn somewhat later than it did on other species. As homesteaders made their way west and the demand for livestock increased, thriving pronghorn herds were reduced to almost the point of extinction. Only 12,000 remained. But once again, the principles of wildlife management were put into action in the nick of time.
The challenge of restoring pronghorn antelope was to return breeding populations to areas of suitable habitat. Once again, the wildlife management technique of trapping and translocating animals proved its value. Between 1937 and 1947, more than 7,000 animals were captured and relocated. New, healthy pronghorn populations were the eventual result.
By 1946, the pronghorn population had increased to over 230,000, almost 20 times the number that existed 2 decades earlier. Today, wildlife managers, along with regulated hunting to maintain herds at optimum levels, have helped to raise the pronghorn population to its highest level in 100 years, over 950,000. The beautiful pronghorn is once again a common and exciting sight in the American West.
The last of the unendangered species we're going to look at is the trumpeter swan. In 1935, the trumpeter swan was in serious danger. Only 73 were known to exist, and they were all in one wildlife refuge.
The comeback of the trumpeter swan is one of wildlife management's greatest successes. The strategy was to raise baby trumpeters in captivity and then release them as adults in national parks and refuges, areas from which they had long been absent. I don't know if there's a more perfect example of the science of wildlife management and the efforts of wildlife managers themselves have brought a species back from the brink of extinction.
Today, we have a thriving population of over 25,000 trumpeter swans.
As we started our presentation, we asked you what you thought the greatest threat to wildlife today was. Habitat destruction, natural predators, hunting? We're not going to ask for a show of hands again, but if you said habitat destruction, you're right. We hope the last 15 minutes has made that clear. We haven't really talked about natural predators like wolves and coyotes, and while they do have an impact, the negative impact of natural predators on most species is negligible compared to that of habitat destruction. And hunting not only has no negative impact, it actually plays a positive role according to wildlife management professionals.
Hunting is not only an acceptable part of wildlife management, it's a necessary one. Everyone should realize that hunting, regulated by the principles of wildlife management, never has, nor does it now, pose a threat to the well-being of any wildlife species. Hunting is a practical and biologically sound method of maintaining healthy wildlife populations because it is carefully regulated and enforced by state and federal wildlife agencies. In addition, the revenues from hunting licenses and the sale of hunting-related equipment provide hundreds of millions of dollars each year to support wildlife management programs.
So now that you know about the unendangered species and the role of wildlife management and their comeback, does anybody have any questions?
Well, what about the future? I mean, the unendangered species sound okay, but I've heard of other animals like wolves and eagles and grizzly bears. What about them?
Well, that's really the big question, isn't it? I'm sure we've had success with deer and elk and turkey, but what comes next? What can we expect with other species? Well, my feeling is, and I know Teresa agrees with me here, is that we have very good reason to be confident. Although it's true that species like wolves and grizzly bears have not recovered as fast as the unendangered species, they're all doing much better. Wolves, as a matter of fact, have thriving populations in Wyoming and Montana and Minnesota.
One thing we can promise you is that wildlife professionals are never going to give up. They'll continue to study threatened species and continue to protect habitat so that one day all threatened wildlife can be on our list of unendangered species.
Well put, Teresa. Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
I'm doing my term paper on this subject, and I'm really interested in wildlife conservation.
Great.
Where can I find more information on wildlife management and the unendangered species?
Any of you can find more information at unendangeredspecies.org or by contacting us at the Council for Wildlife Conservation and Education. We'd be happy to hear from you.
You bet. Oh, thanks for having us, Mr. Baker. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.